The carriage door burst open, and the smell of wine and death came rushing out with the body. I was standing in the snow when they told me my brother was dead. My twin, the man whose face I wore, but whose life I had never been permitted to share. Philippe Duval, 19 years old, heir to a dukedom, a fortune, and a future that should have been divided between us. Instead, it had all been his. And now, in a single frozen moment, it was about to become mine. The man who rode to my village that night did not knock. He kicked in the door of my rented room above the blacksmith's forge, tracking snow across the floor I had just swept. His cloak bore the crest I had seen only once before, embroidered in gold thread on the ring my mother kissed every night before she died. Étienne, he said, and the sound of my own name in a stranger's mouth made my blood run cold. You are coming with me. Now. Tonight. I looked at the small life I had built. A bed with a straw mattress. A candle burned down to nothing. A book of poems I had stolen from a church. I followed him into the darkness, because I had learned long ago that refusal only makes suffering last longer. I was born first. By 7 minutes, they said. Enough time to matter in questions of inheritance. Not enough time to save me from what came after. My mother had been a chambermaid in the Duval estate, young, beautiful, and foolish enough to believe a duke's whispered promises. He took her on a winter night when the snow made the world quiet enough to hide sins. By spring, she was gone, sent away with a small purse of coins and a belly swelling with twins. She raised me alone in a village 3 days' ride from the estate. Her hands grew calloused from washing other people's clothes. Her back curved from years of bending over wash basins. But her bitterness never turned cruel. Not toward me. She told me stories of my father's house. The gilded mirrors. The paintings tall as trees. The way candlelight made everything look like it was made of honey and gold. You belong there, she would say, brushing hair from my forehead with wet fingers. More than he ever will. I thought she meant heaven. When she died, fever took her in 3 days, so fast I barely had time to hold her hand. She pressed the ring into my palm. A signet ring, heavy with gold and gilt. They will need you one day, she whispered, her breath rattling like wine through broken shutters. When he fails them, and he will fail them, promise me you will be ready. I promised. I did not believe her. Philippe's rooms still smelled of him. Wine soaked into velvet. Powder caked in the creases of abandoned shirts. The particular rod of silk, left too long in darkness. I stood in the doorway, afraid to step inside. Afraid that if I crossed that threshold, I would never find my way back to the man I had been. The Duke waited by the fire, his hands trembling so badly the brandy in his glass left amber trails down his wrist. He was older than I had imagined. Smaller. The great monster of my mother's stories had become a frightened old man watching his legacy crumble. He did not look at me as a son. He did not even look at me as a person. He looked at me as a solution to a problem. You will be Philippe, he said, each word precise, rehearsed. You will answer to his name, wear his clothes, sit in his chair at dinner. You will learn his walk, his voice, his cruelties. He finally met my eyes. And you will never, never speak of who you were before. Étienne dies tonight. Do you understand? I thought of the grave already being filled in the family cemetery. A quiet burial. No mourners. A headstone that would bear my brother's name, while his body rotted beneath it. What happens if I refuse? I asked. The Duke swallowed. His throat clicked in the silence. France is changing, he said softly. The people grow hungry. The king grows weak. And the new justice they speak of, it has no patience for questions. He paused. Or for bastards who know too much. I understood. I nodded. That night, a servant helped me into Philippe's clothes. They fit perfectly, of course they did. We had shared a womb. Why not a wardrobe? I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing my face. That was the first mask. Lady Marguerite de Valois had despised Philippe. This was not gossip. It was fact, spoken openly in drawing rooms, and whispered gleefully in servants' quarters. She had been promised to him since childhood, a political knot tied by their fathers when she was 6 and he was 8. A merger of lands, titles, and ambitions that had nothing to do with love. Philippe had treated the engagement as a joke. He mocked her intelligence, her sharp tongue, her refusal to simper and flatter. He drank through their dinners together. He took mistresses openly, parading them past her as if daring her to object. She never did. She simply watched him with eyes like winter lakes, frozen on the surface with unknowable depths beneath. When I met her for the first time as Philippe, she studied me the way a jeweler examines a gemstone suspected of being glass. "You're late," she said. Her voice was cooler than I expected, musical but guarded. "I was delayed," I replied, bowing the way I had been taught. "Forgive me." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or suspicion. "You were always delayed," she said slowly, "but never polite about it." She circled me like a hawk assessing prey. "You seem different, my lord. Thinner, quieter." She tilted her head. "Less drunk." I forced Philippe's careless laugh. "I have been unwell. The physicians recommended temperance." She smiled faintly, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Temperance," she repeated. "How unlike you." Her eyes did not accuse. They measured. They catalogued. They filed away every inconsistency for later examination. That frightened me more than any threat the Duke had made. I learned quickly what it meant to be a nobleman, how to bow without lowering my eyes, submission but never surrender, how to insult without raising my voice, cruelty delivered in velvet tones, how to spend money as though it were air, infinite and meaningless. I learned which fork to use for fish, which wine to pour for which guest, how to laugh at jokes that weren't funny and ignore suffering that was. But cruelty did not come as easily as etiquette. One evening, a young servant, a boy no older than 15, dropped a silver tray while serving dinner. Crystal shattered across marble. Wine spread like blood across white stone. The room went silent. Every guest turned to watch. The boy fell to his knees, trembling, his eyes squeezed shut. Waiting. I knew what Philippe would have done. I had heard the stories. The riding crop he kept by his chair. The casual violence that came as naturally to him as breathing. The boy's shoulders shook. A tear slid down his cheek. "Leave it," I said quietly. "Fetch a cloth from the kitchen. Clean it when we've finished dining." The silence stretched. The boy looked up, stunned. "Go," I said gentler. "It's only glass." He scrambled to his feet and fled. The guests exchanged glances, confusion, suspicion, something that might have been relief. And across the long table, Marguerite watched me with an expression I could not read. That night, as the house fell silent, I found a pair of white gloves left on the windowsill of the library. Her gloves, left behind, on purpose. The Comte Renard Beaumont arrived at the estate 3 weeks after my transformation. He was everything Philippe had been. Charming, wealthy, utterly without conscience. They had been friends since boyhood, which in the language of aristocrats meant rivals, parasites, and keepers of each other's darkest secrets. He smiled too easily, laughed too quickly, and his eyes never stopped moving, cataloging details with the precision of a man who trades in information. "Philippe," he said warmly, embracing me as though we were brothers. His cologne was sweet enough to mask something sour beneath. "How wonderful to see you recovered. We feared the worst." "The worst is yet to come," I said, playing the fatalist Philippe had reportedly loved to perform. "But not tonight." Renard laughed. Over dinner, he told stories of their shared exploits. Women ruined, servants beaten, debts ignored. Each tale was a test, watching to see if I remembered, if I laughed at the right moments, if I added the details only Philippe could know. I navigated carefully, laughing when others laughed, nodding vaguely when specifics were required. But later, in the smoking room, Renard cornered me by the window. You walk differently, he murmured, swirling brandy in his glass. Less like a prince entitled to every step. More like a man who learned to walk quietly, a man who learned hunger. My blood chilled. Illness changes a man, I said. Illness. He smiled. Yes, of course. He raised his glass. I miss the old you, he said softly. But I confess, I rather prefer this one. He drank, never breaking eye contact. That was when I knew he suspected, perhaps had known from the moment he saw me. And he was waiting, patiently, deliberately, to see how valuable that knowledge might become. Paris burned while we danced. At first, it was only whispers. Bread riots in the poorer quarters. Pamphlets nailed to church doors. Names of nobles spoken too loudly in taverns, followed by uncomfortable silence. Then the whispers became shouts. The Bastille fell on a summer afternoon. I heard the news while playing cards with men who owned more land than most villages. They laughed nervously and poured more wine. It will pass, one said. The king will restore order. But the king did not restore order. The king fled, and the order that had kept men like me invisible suddenly collapsed like a house built on rot. The duke, desperate to prove the family's loyalty to whoever would ultimately win, ordered me to attend the National Assembly in his stead. Speak carefully, he warned. Support reform, but not too much. Sympathize with the people, but remember who you are. Who I was. I almost laughed. I stood before the assembly in borrowed clothes and a borrowed name, and I spoke about restraint, about justice, about reform that respected tradition while acknowledging pain. I do not know where the words came from. Perhaps from my mother's stories. Perhaps from the years I spent hungry, while men like Philippe threw away more food in a day than I saw in a month. They applauded. That night, Renard raised his glass at dinner. You'll be remembered, he said, something dark flickering behind his smile. One way or another. Winter came early the year the revolution found its teeth. I walked with Marguerite in the garden behind the estate. Snow dusted the hedges like powdered sugar. Our breath made ghosts in the frozen air. For months, we had circled each other. Careful, curious, never quite touching. She had stopped making excuses to avoid me. I had stopped pretending not to notice when she entered a room. But we had never spoken of what lay beneath the surface. Until now. You don't touch me like you used to, she said quietly, watching the frozen fountain rather than my face. I was not aware I had permission before, I answered. She laughed, a sharp, surprised sound, like ice cracking. Permission, she repeated. Philippe never asked permission for anything in his life. He took what he wanted and broke what he couldn't take. She turned to face me. But you ask questions. You listen when I speak. You hesitate before you act, as if you're afraid of causing harm. Her eyes searched mine. That is not the man I was promised to. That is not the man who made me dread my own wedding day. She stepped closer. I could smell her perfume, jasmine and something darker, like smoke. Who are you? The question hung in the frozen air between us. I wanted to tell her everything. The words pressed against my teeth like prisoners against bars. Every lie I had told, every mask I had worn, every night I had lain awake wondering if I was slowly becoming the brother I had replaced. But the truth was a death sentence. For me. Perhaps for her. So instead of speaking, I kissed her. Her lips were cold from the winter air. But she did not pull away. When we finally separated, she looked at me with something new in her eyes. That, she whispered, was also not Philippe. She smiled. I prefer it. That was the second mask, beginning to crack. The Duke collapsed during a winter ball. One moment he was standing by the fireplace, holding court as he had done for 50 years. The next, he crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. They carried him to his chambers. The physicians came and went, their faces grave. His heart, they said, weakened by strain. By guilt, I thought. I visited him alone on the third night, when the house had fallen silent. He lay in the enormous bed where he had conceived 2 sons and acknowledged only one. His skin had yellowed. His breathing came in rattles that reminded me of my mother's final hours. "You came," he said, his voice thin as paper. "I came." Silence stretched between us, like the years we had never shared. "You were always stronger," he said finally, his eyes glassy with fever or regret. I could not tell which. Even as an infant, the midwife said you fought your way out first, demanded life, before your brother could. He coughed weakly. "I should have kept you, should have found a way. But your mother," he trailed off. "She was a servant, and I was a coward. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I chose wrong," he whispered. "I kept the easy son, the son who would obey, who would smile, who would never question. And I sent away the one who would have made this family great." His hand fumbled toward mine. I let him take it. His fingers were cold and dry, like old parchment. "Can you forgive me?" I looked at this man, my father, who had abandoned me to poverty, who had dragged me back only when he needed me, who had never once called me son. "No," I said quietly, "but I can understand." His eyes closed. He never apologized. I think, in the end, he did not know how. That was the 3rd revelation, not a twist, but an ending. He died 2 days later, and I inherited everything he had never meant to give me. Renard made his move when the terror was at its height. The streets of Paris ran with blood that winter. Aristocrats lined up for the guillotine like cattle for slaughter. The revolution had become a machine that fed on the very people who had birthed it. I had been careful, keeping the estate running, protecting the servants, quietly moving money to those who might need to flee, playing the reformed noble who supported change. But Renard had been more careful. He came to me on a January night, snow falling soft as ash outside the windows. In his hands, he carried a leather folio thick with documents. "I found these in a monastery archive," he said pleasantly, as if discussing the weather. "Letters, records, a very detailed account of a child born to a chambermaid and spirited away in the night." He spread the papers across the desk. "And a death certificate for one Philippe Duval, dated 3 years ago. Curious, isn't it? Given that Philippe Duval is standing before me now." My mouth went dry. "What do you want?" Renard smiled his serpent smile. "I want what Philippe promised me before his unfortunate accident. The Western lands, the shipping contracts, and your support when I make my own claim to the assembly." He leaned closer. "Refuse, and these documents go to the tribunal tomorrow. They do so love unmasking traitors to the revolution." I thought of Marguerite, of the servants who depended on this house, of everything I had built on the foundation of a lie. "And if I agree, then we are partners," Renard said. "Brothers, even. And no one ever needs to know that the great reformer Philippe Duval is actually a peasant playing dress-up." I nodded slowly. "I need time to consider." "You have until morning," he said cheerfully. "Sleep well." He left the documents on the desk. A reminder, a threat. I did not sleep. Instead, I went to Marguerite. She was reading by candlelight when I entered her chambers. She looked up, saw my face, and set aside her book without a word. I told her everything. The twin brother I had never known. The forced transformation. The masks upon masks upon masks. Every lie I had told her. Every truth I had hidden. Every moment I had wanted to confess, but feared the cost. She listened without interrupting. Her face revealed nothing. When I finished, the candle had burned low. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room. "I knew," she said finally. I stared at her. "I knew the first night," she continued calmly, "when you apologized for being late. When you looked at me like I was a person, instead of a possession." She rose and walked toward me. "Men do not change their souls overnight, Étienne. And Philippe had no soul to change." She took my hands in hers. "I watched you for weeks, months. I saw you show mercy to servants. I saw you weep during a concert when you thought no one was watching. I saw you read books Philippe would have burned for kindling. Her eyes glistened. I knew you were not him, and I thank God for it, every single day. Then why didn't you say anything? I asked. Because I was waiting, she said simply. Waiting to see if you would trust me enough to tell me yourself. She smiled, the first genuine smile I had ever seen on her face. And now you have. Renard will destroy us both, I said. If I refuse him, he goes to the tribunal. If I accept, I become his puppet forever. Marguerite's jaw tightened. Then we do neither, she said. We tell the truth ourselves, on our own terms. That's suicide. Perhaps. She squeezed my hands. But I never loved Philippe. I love Étienne, the man he pretended to be, who was real all along. And I would rather die beside you than live another day in a lie. That was the fourth twist, and the only one that mattered. Renard denounced me anyway. Perhaps he never intended to wait. Perhaps he knew that a secret shared is a secret halved. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the cruelty. I was dragged before the Revolutionary Tribunal on a gray February morning. The crowd gathered like ravens scenting death. The prosecutor read the charges in a voice that dripped with righteous fury. Fraud, deception, impersonating a nobleman to preserve aristocratic privilege, crimes against the people of France. I stood in the dock, stripped of silk and title and everything I had borrowed. Marguerite pushed through the crowd. I would speak, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber. I would speak for this man. The prosecutor sneered. And what would a lady know of truth? More than you would credit, she replied coolly. And I am no lady. Not anymore. She stepped to the front of the gallery and faced the judges. This man came from nothing, she said. He was born in a stable, raised in an orphanage, and lived 20 years in poverty, while his brother enjoyed every luxury. He did not choose this deception. It was forced upon him by a dying duke who cared more for legacy than for justice. She turned to look at me. But the man who took Philippe's place did not become Philippe. He became better. He showed mercy where Philippe showed cruelty. He served the people Philippe would have exploited. He loved where Philippe only consumed. Her voice broke. If that is a crime, then I am guilty too. For I knew the truth, and I protected it. Because the man I fell in love with was never the heir to a dukedom. He was a peasant boy who learned kindness in the dirt, and grace in suffering, and courage in the face of impossible choices. The crowd murmured. The prosecutor demanded my real name. Silence fell. I took a breath. My name is Étienne, I said. I have no family name. My mother was never permitted to give me one. I was born in a stable and raised in a convent orphanage. I learned to read from stolen books, and to hope from a woman who had every reason to despair. I looked at Marguerite. I became a duke's son because I had no choice. I became a man worthy of this woman, because of every choice after that. The judges conferred. They spared my life. Barely. The vote was close enough that I heard it could have gone either way. Renard, exposed as a conspirator in the original deception, was less fortunate. The revolution consumed its own with particular appetite. I did not mourn him. The Duke's will was read a week later. Most of it was standard, lands dispersed, titles dissolved, the usual picking over of a dead man's bones. But at the end, the solicitor paused. There is an addendum, he said slowly, added in the Duke's own hand, 3 days before his death. He read, "To the son I never acknowledged, who bore the weight of my sins with more grace than I deserved. You were always the true heir, not by blood or law, but by the only thing that matters, your character. May you find the peace I never could. May you build what I only knew how to inherit. May you love and be loved in return." The solicitor looked up. It was never legally binding, of course. The revolutionary government had already seized the estates. I nodded, but Marguerite took my hand. It was binding enough, she said. We left Paris at dawn, on a morning when the world smelled of rain and new beginnings. No titles, no carriages, no servants trailing behind. Just two people, who had found each other in the ruins of a world that had tried to keep them apart. We settled eventually in a small village in the south, far from the capital and its hungers. I worked as a teacher, letters, arithmetic, the poetry I had once stolen from churches. Marguerite organized a school for girls who reminded her of everything she had been denied. We had 3 children, then 4, a house that leaked in winter and bloomed with roses in spring. It was not the life I was born to. It was not the life I was forced to pretend to. It was better. Years later, when France had exhausted itself and built something new from the wreckage, a young journalist traveled to our village. He had heard rumors, stories, a tale of a false duke who had been real, a peasant who had been noble, a love that had survived revolution. He asked me to confirm it. I sat on the porch of our small house, grandchildren playing in the garden, Marguerite's hand in mine. I have been 2 men in my life, I told him. The first was born in a stable and dreamed of bread. The second was made in a palace and dreamed of freedom. I looked at my wife, at the life we had built, at everything that had grown from the ashes of everything we had lost. But I learned something in between, I said. I learned that masks can save you. They can protect you from enemies, from circumstances, from the cruelty of a world that judges by birth instead of worth. I squeezed Marguerite's hand. But only love lets you take them off. The journalist wrote it down. I don't know if he believed me, but Marguerite smiled. And that was truth enough.